Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Madison, and the focus is his path to politics. Madison was born in 1751 in Port Conway, Virginia. His parents, James Sr. and Nellie, wealthy family, plantation owners, and their family business was largely based on tobacco, with a large slave population working in the fields to serve their economic well-being. Well, Madison was the oldest of 12 children, so a good-sized family, but he had very little interest in sort of working in the family business. Now, he was also a tiny child, and in fact never grew more than 5'4", the smallest of all American presidents, and he was a sickly child as well, always some ailment or another, and maybe these were some of the reasons why he wasn't interested as much to go out in the fields and work in the farms. So instead, he really focused on his education. Went off to boarding school for a while. He also had a lot of private tutoring when he was back at home, and eventually he went off to college. But instead of heading south in Virginia to William and Mary, where most of the elite members of the Virginia societies would send their men off to college to William and Mary, he went north instead, went to the College of New Jersey, later renamed Princeton. It was thought that maybe it was because of the climate, where he was such a sickly child that even as a teenager now, he wanted to be in the most healthier climate and thought that perhaps Princeton, New Jersey was preferable to Williamsburg, Virginia. But in any case, he spent 3 hard-working years finishing his college education, and then he stuck around for an additional year where he spent a lot of private time with the Reverend John Witherspoon. Now, Witherspoon, who was the president of the college, was also a Presbyterian minister of Scottish descent, but he was really a key leader in Enlightenment thinking. A lot of the new era of thinking about society and government and how they were all going to work together. He focused a lot of his studies, and Madison focused on this as well, on sort of moral philosophy and concepts of natural law. These were many of the ideas that really informed the thinking of a lot of the founding fathers. Well, Madison left college, came back home in 1773. It's actually a new home, a larger plantation. Montpelier was what it was called. But Madison also came back at a time of great turmoil going on in the colonies. The British, the mother country, had imposed some taxes and other acts that the colonists, were offended by. They thought were totally inappropriate. Taxation without representation, these kinds of comments, from the Stamp Act to the Townshend Act and most recently the Tea Act. A lot of the rebellion against the crown was really centered more in Massachusetts, but Virginia, as the largest colony amongst the 13 colonies, actually had a lot of rebellious nature to it as well. And Madison was sort of taking all of this in while figuring out what is he going to do for a career. In fact, the only career James Madison ever had was politics. He was one of the nation's first career politicians. Now, he was too young to participate in either the first or second Continental Congresses in the 1774 and 1775 period, but he did get his first start in 1776 at the 5th Virginia Convention. Now, after the Declaration of Independence was passed, a lot of the states now, not colonies, because they considered themselves independent from the British Crown, they wanted to establish their own constitutions. And Madison was part of the elite gathering of really a who's who in Virginia that came together in 1776 to craft the Constitution for Virginia. Again, Madison was there. He wasn't terribly active, a much more junior member of the gathering, but he made a pretty important connection. It was the first time that he and Thomas Jefferson got together on a topic, and the topic was religious freedom, something they both cared a lot about, animated by sort of the issue of going from the status quo, where the Anglican Church had a significant role in the government and in society within Virginia, and put a lot of pressure on people to join that particular religion. Madison and Jefferson were of the mind that the idea of religious toleration wasn't a far enough move. They wanted complete religious freedom as the principle, at least in their state of Virginia, including the freedom to not belong to any religion at all. Well, they started those discussions, and it would take 10 years, but they would finally get it enacted into statute. Now, as for the war, Madison had really no role. He was technically a colonel in the local militia, but he was never mustered into the army, certainly never had any action, because again, he continued his career in politics. He went to the Virginia House of Delegates, where he first won election, then he lost re-election, but then he was appointed to a new position at the Council of State, which was this construct in Virginia of a handful of folks who would oversee the governor. And finally, he made it to the national scene in 1779. Again, this is during the Revolutionary War, and he's elected to the Confederation Congress. Now, the national government at the time during the Revolutionary War was under a construct called the Articles of Confederation. And it was a relatively weak construct from a national standpoint. There was no executive or separate judiciary or even a bicameral legislature. It was a single house legislature. Each state had one vote and had very little power to enforce any of its decisions upon the individual states. Now, in 1781, Madison, along with others, the frustration is starting to mount as they're really being ineffective as trying to pull together a national government. In fact, at the time, he writes a letter to Jefferson, who's now serving as a minister overseas on behalf of his country, that he says the situation of most of the states is such that 2 or 3 vessels of force employed against their trade will make it in their interest to yield prompt obedience to all just requisitions. In fact, Madison proposed an amendment to the Articles of Confederation to give them more power to do just that. It did not pass. Part of the challenge under the Articles, it took all 13 colonies, a unanimous vote, to pass any amendment to the Articles. This was one of many, many that did not get through. In fact, things actually got even worse from a governance standpoint after the victory at Yorktown, which brought the fighting in the Revolutionary War to an end. So this is October of 1781. General George Washington, along with the French, surround General Cornwallis of the British at Yorktown. It's a siege, it's an American victory, and the war effectively comes to an end. 2 more years of negotiating to actually get the final peace treaty over in Europe, but in the meantime, the states really started to go their separate ways, kind of their own realms of sovereignty. Some were creating their own treaties with each other and foreign countries. Some were printing their own money, and people like Madison were really concerned about even the viability of whether or not they could make it as a unified union. Another element that Madison touched on, and this is now 1783, he really focused most of his time on domestic policy, but he had a caution for his colleagues about not getting involved in the foreign affairs, in particular in Europe. He said in a comment in the Confederation Congress that the true interest of these states requires that they should be as little as possible entangled in the politics and controversies of European nations. This idea of neutrality in foreign policy was still somewhat of a new concept, and of course France had been a key ally along with the Netherlands in helping out the colonies and now states in gaining their independence from Britain. But Madison is suggesting that neutrality is the way to go. He's pretty prescient because this concept would be adopted by President George Washington when the Constitution finally kicks in and the constitutional government takes over. So there's a little early thoughts from Madison on foreign policy. Madison, in the middle of the 1780s, was back in the Virginia General Assembly, and he finally completed that 10-year journey to get the Statute for Religious Freedom passed in the state of Virginia. And part of that statute said that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And then they added something at the very end. We are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. This was a powerful, bold statement in favor of religious freedom. Madison was thrilled to inform Jefferson of the news. Jefferson was so excited about this, it was one of the 3 items he put on his epitaph. He was so proud of this transformational change, a product of the Enlightenment, coming home and finding a home in his home state of Virginia. And Madison was the one who drove it through the legislature and got it in over the top. All of this considered, Madison's now been a politician for about 10 years. He's 35 years old and he is worried. He's worried about the state of his nation under this weak construct of the Articles of Confederation. He was a studious intellectual, had a political scientist about him, but he also now had 10 years of experience. And Madison was ready to try to improve the entire system of American government. But that's the story for another day. That is James Madison and his path to politics from the life of James Madison. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.